All right. Well, let me introduce one of our faculty members. Dr. Blanky is here, and I think I saw Dr. Yano sneak in. He might have stepped out for a minute. So Dr. Blanky is a professor in microbiology, and he takes on quite a few undergraduate researchers. I know he has a booming voice. Do you want the mic, or do you want to? We're videotaping.
I think I'm going to need the mic.
Okay, so we're going to give him the mic, and I'll let him talk to you about what he expects of students in this lab.
Well, I'm getting mic'd up. It's great to see everyone. Tina really gave you a great overview, so I have to cover some of that. I'd reiterate, though, that when you do write a faculty member, make sure to personalize a little bit. And personally, I delete the ones that start with Dear Madam. Just my own thing. Yeah, I get about 1 of 20 that start with either Mrs. Blanky or Madam. So, I figured at least you haven't gone to the website at that point.
This is Dr. Yano. So we'll let Dr. Blanky talk first, and then we'll let Dr. Yano speak.
Okay, so again, it's great that you're here. It's great that you have interest in undergraduate research. This is, you probably hear this about a lot of things, but this is potentially a life-changing decision for probably many of you. I can say that because for myself, it was. So when I was an undergraduate several years ago, undergraduate research was not that common. It wasn't part of the culture of research at that time. And so I was very fortunate to get an undergraduate fellowship from the National Science Foundation to go do summer research. Someone just asked about summer research. And it was really a life-changing time for me. It really, my career just, well, I didn't have a career at that point, but my career plans really deviated very sharply at that point. And it was hard for me to believe, in fact, that one could make a living from discovery and investigation. It was just a concept that I couldn't really believe, you know. And I really haven't been sorry since then. So I think undergraduate research is important for a lot of things. I think regardless of what you do with your career, what your career plans are, I think the perspective you will get from doing research is unique. It's something that you won't encounter really in any of your undergraduate classes or laboratories, or really anywhere else. And I think that I've had undergraduates who come back and told me that the perspective that they had when they were in lab, that they obtained in lab, has been really useful to them, no matter what they ended up doing. So Tina's asked that we give a faculty member's perspective about expectations, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. My laboratory, I'm in microbiology up in this building. We study, as Tina brought up there, we study microbe-host interactions, particularly those which are harmful to humans. And so this is, of course, a very exciting area of interest to us. I think throughout MCB, each laboratory, one of the great jewels here at the university is the type of research that's available to you to participate in. Okay, and this may be something that you'll need to think about if you decide to do this, which lab, in fact, to go to. I can say a lot about that. So how does the process work? In my laboratory, we've been very supportive of undergraduate research. We currently have 10 students doing MCB 290 research. I have 9 graduate students and a postdoc. And one of the reasons I'm so supportive is, of course, because I think it's a great opportunity for undergraduates, but also for the graduate students and postdoc in the lab. It's critical, all of them, no matter what they do, again, and once they get their advanced degree, their PhD, will be working with younger people, supervising, coaching, mentoring. And it's critical that they have that experience of learning how to do that. So we have an active program in lab for the mentors also, how to do this correctly. It's challenging but incredibly rewarding at the same time. So the way it works in our lab, and I think Tina alluded to this, every lab is different. And I think that's the number one thing to keep in mind, is that every lab is different, every lab culture is different, and of course the research is different. But that's to be expected. So one of the things that you want to look for when you're looking for a lab is a culture that you think you'll be happy in. And this is maybe the most important thing I can tell you. The way we do it is a little bit different than most laboratories, I think. 3 times a year, we ask Tina to help us out by putting out some type of ad or whatever it is, a call for researchers. And what we do is we we identify graduate students in the lab who have a project that looks really ripe and really exciting. And so we'll decide beforehand we need 2 people or 3 people or whatever it is. We typically have interviews, or the first step is that prospective undergraduate researchers come in and talk to the people in the laboratory. In some ways that's more important than talking to me, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So typically we have between 30 and 50 people come in over the course of a couple weeks. And they'll talk directly with the person they would potentially be working with. And it's a great opportunity to do a lot of things. One is for graduate students to sometimes you can just meet someone and there's a good chemistry there. So graduate students, after a while, can really pick this out very well. This is a really important point. It's also a good time for you to see what your initial impression of the culture in the laboratory is. Talking to graduate students, the people who are in the lab every day, is a really important way to do this. So after a couple weeks, I'll usually get a list from them of maybe 5 to 6 people, and then I'll invite them in and we'll have an interview. And it's never like people expect. So if by chance any of you do decide that you're interested in what we do and want to come, you won't be surprised, but most people are. So my job during that interview first is to tell people what the advantages of doing undergraduate research are, and that's fairly easy to do. But then I try to talk them out of doing it. And the reason is because although it's a great opportunity, it's also a tremendous commitment to everyone involved, including yourself. Okay? And if you really don't want to do this, you're doing yourself a disservice by trying. Okay? But equally so, for the graduate students and postdocs in the lab, this is a tremendous commitment on their part. And what you'll find is that the person you're working with is completely committed and dedicated to you. It's really pretty fascinating, but this is almost 100% true. Okay, so at that meeting we lay out, you mentioned expectations. And really my expectations of anyone coming into the laboratory are just 3 things. One is the commitment part of it. And the commitment is pretty, on the surface, may sound pretty heavy. So we really synchronize things in the laboratory. So someone asked about summer. So the commitments for our lab is that when you start, you'll work all the way till you graduate. That you'll work in the summers. Okay. And we actually ask that people plan accordingly. So we have all our undergraduates start the day after final exams. And to work through, and then we ask everyone to take 3 weeks off at the end of the summer. Okay, this works very well for a lot of reasons I don't have time to go into, but it works extremely well. And then there's the whatever 15 hours a week or whatever it turns out to be, that commitment. Okay? So it's a big commitment. We know that for sure. And so number one, if you decide you can't do it, so I say go back and then talk to your parents. Your parents are supportive. Say that's a great idea, but really go tell them that. Say, I may not see you in June next year. And in some cases, parents come back and say, no way. And if that's the case, that's great. It's better to know at that point in time. Okay, so commitment is number 1. Consistency is number 2. How many of you here play the violin? Maybe you got a couple. How about other instruments? Okay, so what happens when you stop practicing? You lose that skill. Research is more like playing a violin than it is riding a bicycle, right? You say, once you learn how to ride a bike, you never forget. It's true. Not so with things that are sort of higher order, like playing a violin. Research is like that. And so the consistency part of the equation is that 15 hours a week means 15 hours a week. And that 15, where is that 15 hours? It's not a magic number. What we found, in fact, is that when you get much less than about 12, there's this spinning of the wheels phenomenon, where someone comes in the lab every week and it's like starting over. Okay, and so if a person misses a week, this is very, very noticeable, very reproducible, this part of it. So we ask for consistency. But the most important thing, so we have commitment and consistency, but the most important thing is engagement. Engagement is number 1. And by engagement, we mean sort of this approach to being in the lab that exceeds just spending the hours there, spending the time, but really approaching the problem you're working on in a deeper way than you may have ever done before. And there's a lot that goes into it, but it's very obvious when a person's engaged and when they're not engaged. At this meeting, so we have consistency, and engagement. And we talk about grades immediately. So my philosophy is everyone each semester starts with an A, and you can only blow it after that. All right? And so how do you blow it? You don't fulfill those three aspects: the commitment, consistency, engagement. Okay, so our goal is that everyone who does this gets an A, that everyone be successful. And again, there's a lot of reasons to do this, including tangible and intangible. So what am I doing on time? 2 more minutes, okay. Once you get into the lab, the expectations are to fulfill those 3 requirements, but also we have meetings each week. We have an undergraduate meeting once a week where we talk about career development. So you have career development training also in the laboratory in addition to scientific. And so the expectation is that you come to all of these. One of the things that we do, and maybe other labs do as well, is that once we have that meeting at the beginning with me, I ask the student if they're still interested. So number one, I say, go talk to your parents. In 48 hours, let me know if you still want to do this or not. And about 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7 say no. And I think it's, again, the best thing for everyone, probably. They can do it. The next thing they have to do is to write what is essentially a contract. It's more of a memorandum of understanding of what their understanding of the expectations are of them. But more importantly, I want them to lay out their expectations of us. Okay? Because you should have expectations of the laboratory you're entering. You should have some idea of what these expectations are. And if they're in line with what we believe they should be as well, it's usually a really, really good fit. Okay, I think I'm almost out of time. Do you have any quick questions? Okay, if you do, shoot me an email and be happy to talk about it. You'll probably hear sort of a different perspective now, or maybe additional perspective, I should say.
Thank you, Dr. Blanky. So Dr. Yano is a professor in molecular and integrative physiology. He also works in Beckman Institute, and he's just going to give you a little bit of background of what his lab is like and what his expectations are.
All right, so thanks very much. That was great. I actually really learned quite a bit right there in terms of ways of working with undergrads. So my lab now, we're about 7 years old. We've had maybe 40 or so undergrads come through the lab. And I'll say a few words about our approach to undergrads here in a minute. I do want to echo what Dr. Blanky said about my own personal experience with research when I was an undergrad. So I actually went here to the U of I many, many years ago. I feel like I've done a life sentence in Champaign-Urbana. But I came down here, like many of you guys, thinking I was going to come here for 4 years and then go off to medical school, and that would be it. I really hadn't considered research as a career ever. There was nobody in my family who was doing research. It just wasn't a thing that anybody did. But then I ended up joining a lab. There was a Howard Hughes Fellowship Program for a summer research opportunity, and I worked for a guy named Tony Waldrop. I don't know if you guys remember Tony. But I spent a summer doing research in that lab, and it was totally transformative for me. I had never experienced that kind of pace of work before, where you come in every morning, you spend 6 or 7 hours just setting up your experiment, physically setting up all the tubing and the various pieces of equipment, 3 or 4 more hours fighting with the equipment, and the last 2 or 3 hours collecting data. And it was really just an amazing, fun, exciting experience for me, and it really opened my eyes and literally changed my life, and that's what made me want to get a PhD ultimately. So I think there is this sort of latent opportunity that you guys may not realize by working in a lab. It may really open up vistas that you hadn't considered before. Of course, the other reason people join labs, as was mentioned before, it's a good experience. You're trying, many of you, to look at various health-related careers, and these kinds of experiences can help facilitate that process. So in terms of our lab, we do auditory neurophysiology research. We work on mice. We study how the auditory system functions, how various structures are connected to each other. We use imaging and electrophysiology techniques primarily with some anatomy. And when it comes to undergrads, typically we don't have a specific recruitment mechanism. Undergrads are just often emailed throughout the year, and depending on our needs, we'll potentially take some on. Typically undergrads will work with a grad student or with a postdoc, and this is a big part of their development as well, and this is often what determines whether or not we'll be taking an undergrad. Meaning often a grad student will come into my office and say, it'd be really helpful if I had somebody to help me out with some tissue processing or with data analysis. Is there anybody who's been looking for a position? And I'll go back through my emails and see what I've gotten in terms of inquiries, and that's often how we end up deciding that we're going to be looking for an undergrad. In terms of the types of work that undergrads do, it really varies in our lab. We've had, of the 40 or so undergrads we've had, 5 or 6 have really, I would say, blossomed, did senior theses. 3 of them actually joined the lab as graduate students later. And then the rest, it's sort of it's a variety. Some have sort of maintained sort of an arm's distance with the work, not really done a whole lot, and then others sort of everywhere in between. And so typically, because we're not, at least I'm not quite sure how committed somebody is, and maybe I should have them, sign a memorandum of understanding or have some sort of formalized way of setting this thing up. We'll often put them on a project where they're just sort of observing, seeing how often neuroanatomy is done, maybe doing some data processing, meaning taking spreadsheets and taking data from one spreadsheet and moving it to another spreadsheet, sort of grunt work that isn't, if somebody isn't doing a good job, often it's kind of obvious and we can always start again. But then over time, depending on how they do, we may increase their level of responsibility. And that's the reason why we like to get students who are early in their education process. Second semester freshmen, sophomores. If somebody emails me just before their junior and certainly their senior year, I would be a lot less interested in taking them on in the lab, because usually it takes a good year or 2 until they're actually able to learn enough to actually help the lab and to be productive. So the earlier you start, the better. But we've had undergrads that begin sort of in this way, just kind of observing and maybe learning some neuroanatomy techniques, working with fixed tissue, where again, if they have some trouble with it or doesn't work out so well, it's usually not a tremendous loss to the lab. But then over time, we've had several have gotten to the point where they're working completely independently of any graduate student or any postdoc, reporting directly to me, meaning we meet once a week or once every 2 weeks to touch base, but they're doing their own surgeries, they're doing their own perfusions and experiments, etc. We've had several undergrads on publications, and this really seems to me to depend on the student. If the student is really motivated and really, is thinking about science as a career, they'll often really dive into it. And others, this time in the lab is often their time to realize, well, maybe science isn't for me as a career. And I think that's a valuable experience to get in the lab and realize what's not for you, and maybe don't get quite as involved in the lab. So that's more or less what the expectations are for undergrads. Again, typically they begin in the second semester of their freshman year, first semester of their sophomore year. I like them to stay until they graduate, if they're willing to do that. And summers as well. There's grant programs available through MCB, there's grant programs through Beckman as well that can help support undergrad students. So usually there's a mechanism to support students who are going to stay here during the summertime. A couple of words of advice, just from somebody who gets these emails in terms of what would actually pique my interest. I think it's probably the case that many faculty members get many emails from interested undergrads. far too many emails, far too many inquiries for us to be able to take everybody. And so the question is, what would the advice be that I could give you to make sure that you have an email that will get a response? First of all, please spell the professor's name correctly and refer to them by their last name. I had somebody email me, "Hey Dan," one time as the intro to their email. They actually got a position in the lab because they were pretty exceptional. But the point is, be respectful. And you should say something in your email. If this is a cold email, you've never met this person before, about their research. Look through it. I mean, all of us have all of our papers available online. Look through, to the extent that you can, what they've done and indicate why you're interested in their lab. You talk about their research. I'm interested in the work that you do on XYZ. So they know that it's not just a canned email. If their name is in one font and the text is in a different font and is totally generic, then you're probably not going to get a response. And if you don't get a response, I certainly wouldn't take it personally, just because all of us, get lots of emails like this all the time. The other bit of advice that I would give, I've had a couple of students, and I'd be happy to get your opinions on this as well. I've had a couple of students who felt that the way to really maximize their research experience was to try to work with multiple professors while they're here. And I understand maybe they're trying to get lots of letters of recommendation, etc. My feeling is when you get into a laboratory, there's so much that you can gain from that one laboratory. There's, as an undergraduate spending 15 hours a week in that lab, your job is really to try to master all of this material as best you can and to really shine in that lab to the point where hopefully you could submit a senior thesis or get your name potentially on a publication, or even be a lead author on a publication. And I really don't see how that's possible if you're splitting your time between, of course, a heavy workload in school, labs, multiple labs, and perhaps other extracurricular activities. It strikes me as not a particularly good strategy to be able to really, shine during this particular opportunity. So I think those are the main points that I wanted to cover. So maybe I could hang out for a little while and answer questions with Dr. Blanky and see if there's questions you guys have.
Okay, so you got a couple of different perspectives just in these two professors that are here. I like to have Dr. Blanky come because he has a very well laid out and strategic plan in terms of finding people in his lab. You will find that other faculty members are just very whimsical, and whoever shows up to talk to them, they'll consider it and then they'll take them or they won't take them. So again, every professor is different. You need to know what their expectations are. Do you have questions for these two faculty members who came and spent their time with us today? Yeah.
If one has any relevant experience or skills in, say, data analysis, would it be helpful to mention those in the introductory email?
Yeah, I guess what I would say, if you don't mind, I'll take it first. So yeah, so in the introductory email, you should definitely send your resume along with the email, and and whatever relevant experience you have on there, particularly if it's data processing, you program in a particular language, or did high school research. We had somebody recently email and indicate they did a bunch of tissue processing in high school, and I thought that was pretty interesting. I also have my graduate students or postdocs, whoever is going to be the person to potentially accept that student, they're the ones who do the initial interview and they evaluate the resume. And I had a graduate student who was totally impressed by an undergrad who had operated a forklift when she was in high school. He thought that was the coolest thing and indicated a real work ethic in that particular person. So yeah, put your CV in there and indicate whatever relevant or seemingly irrelevant experience you might have, because we'll want to see that.
Yeah, just one thing to add to the occasionally we'll get emails where it's in. A person will say, "I'm familiar with," and then about 1,000 different techniques. And so what that tells us immediately is probably you heard of them, may have read about them, but it's good to be, I think, as exact and as straightforward as possible in describing what you've done. And it's not necessarily, it really isn't that much of a negative if you don't have experience. It really doesn't have to be at all. So you shouldn't be afraid of that at all, that part.
And that actually is part of our undergraduate student profile that you fill out. It asks if you have any previous research experience, and you can say what you want there. I think there's a place for just general comments as well, so that is there. Other questions for our faculty? Yeah.
So yes, we definitely don't expect any particular experience, right? So if your resume just says that you worked at McDonald's or whatever in high school and that's it, that's perfectly fine. In the email that you sent to us to talk about other things that we're looking for, I did forget to mention, I'll give you my take on undergraduate grades and how much they matter to me. For me, they don't matter that much, right? To do well in school, I think, is sort of a different skill than doing well in the lab. They both involve commitment, but there are plenty of examples of people who are great scientists who just weren't great students, and vice versa. In fact, I think when it comes to GRE scores, I think they're really predictive of how people do in grad school in the classroom portion, but not particularly predictive of how they do in the science portion. That said, if you completely trashed your grades your first couple of years, that would be a little bit concerning, but I wouldn't, you know, if you weren't the greatest student in the world, I wouldn't be discouraged. At least for me, and I imagine other faculty members like me, who that's not a major consideration. I'm much more impressed if you've done research or done other kinds of activities that indicate that you can sustain a commitment to